basically every story that you read in corporate media right now, you don't even have to be like super knowledgeable of the topic. Just go through the story and see how many times they say US officials said, anonymous senior level CIA officials or intelligence officials said, or military officials. It's every single story. And it just shows how totally propagandized we are 24/7 on a daily basis. It's really crazy. And I do have to say, there are, of course, every country has propaganda. State media outlets, of course, push propaganda. But I really do think it's true that the American people in the US are probably the most propagandized people on earth.
Ben Norton, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here. Long time watcher, first time guest, I guess.
Yeah, it's an honor to have you on the show. I'm a big fan of yours and of Moderate Rebels. And, a question that seems to come up sometimes among folks on Twitter is what is the difference between Moderate Rebels and the Gray Zone?
Well, Moderate Rebels is you could say it's kind of part of the larger umbrella of the Gray Zone. The Gray Zone is a media platform, and there's a video component, of course, but it started out as strictly print, and it's kind of grown since then. And it started out, my colleague Max Blumenthal founded it as a section at Alternet, which is why it used to be called the Gray Zone Project. And it was strictly print. And then he brought me on. Salon purged a lot of the left-wing writers. They brought in a Silicon Valley neoliberal CEO. And then when I was purged from Salon, when I was laid off, he brought me over to Alternet. It was the Gray Zone Project, strictly print. And then he and I created a podcast, Moderate Rebels. And then when Alternet got bought by a Clintonian neoliberal, not well known, but a guy who's a multimillionaire who donated a lot of money to Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign, he bought Alternet and turned it really into even more of an aggregation platform and laid pretty much everyone off and got rid of the Gray Zone immediately. And then we went independent. So Moderate Rebels pre-existed independent, the Gray Zone, but then we dropped the project, we went independent. And then we brought on Aaron Mate and Anya Parampol, who also have their own shows. So they're all kind of related, and maybe that's too much information more than what people need, but I don't mind that people kind of conflate the two. Moderate Rebels is just the show that Max Blumenthal and I host as part of like the Gray Zone network, if you will.
And, this actually brings up a subject that I like talking about as far as independent media, because it's something that I've recognized, and I think a lot of other folks out there have recognized, is that independent media to a large extent seems to have been co-opted. You see this especially with how Democracy Now! Has treated Russiagate and also the Young Turks. I actually recently had Robbie Yeager on the show. He's done some investigation into the funding that the Young Turks has gotten. It seems to me as though there really aren't that many sources for good independent media out there. You have Katie Halper and Matt Taibbi and Jimmy Dore and you folks, and that's pretty much it.
Yeah, this is something that we talk about a lot. It's something that keeps me up at night. The destruction of the independent left and the media arm specifically. It's part of a larger political problem, which we're going to talk about today, I'm sure, which is the sidelining of independent leftists, anyone who doesn't just kowtow to the Democratic Party and kind of toe the party line. But it's so evident in the media. And I have to say, you named some of my favorite colleagues who are great, journalists and columnists and, lefty pundits. Not every pundit is bad. And, Katie Halper is great. Jimmy Dore is great. What's really sad, though, is that even though there are a lot of great media commentators on the left, there's almost no investigative journalism. And not in any way trying to, boast or anything, but the Gray Zone is really one of the only platforms where people who are, we're on the left and we're also anti-imperialist, and we're strictly dedicated to doing investigative journalism specifically. I mean, you mentioned some people, Rabbi Yeager's done some good stuff. TYT has had some people who did good investigative work, and Mint Press also has a pretty good team. But excluding a few individuals, Gareth Porter, some other people, as institutions on the left, there are so few investigative journalism websites devoted to digging up a lot of this stuff. So that's why Max founded the Gray Zone, and it's kind of evolved over the years, but we're investigative journalists at heart. And as much on social media, on Twitter, as much as I like to argue and debate and make fun of the stupid pundits who dominate the corporate media, I think my heart is more in these long investigations, which is why I often end up writing these interminable 6,000 word articles, just digging into just the horrible things that the empire is up to.
And on the subject of democracy now, I think that's a really big shame, just because that was really influential for me in the 2000s during the Bush years. It seemed as though that was really where you'd hear the true criticism of the Bush administration, and not just the surface level neoliberal criticisms. One accusation that I've heard is that they get funding from organizations like the Ford Foundation, and that may be a corrupting influence. Do you think that that's the case?
Well, they get a lot of foundation money. In fact, I haven't looked at the tax records in several months. It's been a while, but if I remember correctly, in 2018, Democracy Now!'s revenue, operating expenses and revenue was around $11 million, maybe $12 million. This is a massive operation. It's no longer the grassroots independent media organization that Democracy Now! Used to be, when it was run out of an old firehouse in Manhattan. It's not corporate in the sense that it's for profit, but it's kind of become corporate in the sense of how it is structured as an institution, and is almost entirely funded by foundations. The last tax records I looked at, which were from 2 years ago, show that a very small percentage of Democracy Now!'s revenue comes from small donations. It's almost entirely bankrolled by these massive foundations. You mentioned the Ford Foundation, which we have to mention. The Ford Foundation was created as a CIA cutout, and of course Henry Ford himself was an avowed Nazi who received the highest civilian honors from the Nazi regime. He personally met with Adolf Hitler, and then when Henry Ford died, his family, partially to try to make up for the fact that he was a notorious Nazi and anti-Semite, they used his wealth to fund this massive foundation. But what's also not known is that along with the Rockefellers, a lot of that money was used to help bankroll Cold War efforts and work as kind of CIA pass-throughs, so in doing kind of outsourced work on behalf of the CIA and the U.S. national security state. And the Ford Foundation, I was just looking at this recently, William Bloom, one of the greatest investigative journalists in U.S. history, in his legendary book, Killing Hope, which I would highly recommend to anyone watching or listening to this. In Killing Hope, he actually talked about how in the Cold War, the Ford Foundation was used as a pass-through to fund fascist paramilitary terror groups in Germany, which was, of course, divided. And they were largely former Nazis who were supported by the Ford Foundation, the CIA, and the West German capitalist government to support these terror groups, which in East Germany, in the DDR, the socialist part of Germany, they carried out terror attacks, bombing infrastructure. They even poisoned milk, powdered milk for school children. So the Ford Foundation has this horrible history, and rebranded sometime toward the end of the Cold War and after the collapse of the Eastern Bloc, and they became kind of like a woke, progressive foundation, which really distances itself from talk of economic redistribution and focuses on some issues that are, of course, are very important: anti-racism, women's rights, abortion rights, things like that. But it's just really interesting to see this group that has a history of supporting literal Nazi death squads and working with the CIA has kind of rebranded. And you have to say that the Ford Foundation is really a form of counterinsurgency. And what it's used to do is to fund groups on the left that are on message, that are respectable, that aren't going to rock the boat too much. And unfortunately, as Democracy Now! Has tamed its left edge and become much more sympathetic to the kind of progressive wing of the Democratic Party, on the issue of imperialism, Democracy Now! Has completely dropped the ball. And we can talk more about that, but totally given into Russiagate. They had Kurt Eichenwald on, a guy who, first of all, this is a weirdo who exposed himself on Twitter for liking tentacle porn. But even aside from that, I mean, this is a guy who is a total neoliberal. On foreign policy, he's a war hawk. Democracy Now! Had Kurt Eichenwald on to push Russiagate. And then this isn't even to mention, I mean, it's odious coverage of Syria. And I know Syria is controversial on the left. I don't think it should be, but Democracy Now! Has completely just taken the line of the kind of NGO foundation left, and a host of other issues. Even on Venezuela, frankly, Democracy Now!'s coverage has been very bad. And they might, lightly criticize the Trump administration for just being so blatantly far right, so blatantly neo-colonial in its attitude, but they have basically abandoned support for Chavismo and a lot of other progressive movements in Latin America. So I think definitely a big part of that is the foundation money, but it's also just part of the ossification of the US left and the NGOization of the US left. And so many of the people who work at Democracy Now!, including and especially Nermeen Sheikh, who has become really the most important person after Amy Goodman herself. Juan Gonzalez has kind of partially retired, and Amy Goodman is also, she's kind of moving toward a transition eventually. And Nermeen Sheikh totally comes out of the foundation and NGO world. She comes from a filthy rich, extremely powerful family. And Nermeen Sheikh, what was she doing before she worked at Democracy Now!? She was working for all of these prominent Western powerful think tanks, including the Asia Foundation. And when she was at the Asia Foundation, she actually did an interview. She hosted an interview, moderated an interview with Henry Kissinger. And I've posted about this on social media. And it was a total softball interview with one of the worst war criminals in U.S. history. So, I mean, all these issues are related. But people on the left will sometimes talk about the nonprofit industrial complex. It's a very real issue that we need to talk more about. And the nonprofit industrial complex has really just devoured independent left-wing media.
Well, I do have to say, conversely, one thing that I'm kind of impressed by and surprised by is the fact that Matt Taibbi still writes for Rolling Stone, and that they allow this platform for him and Katie Halper called Useful Idiots. I know that Rolling Stone originally, that was where Hunter S. Thompson started out, and it was more of an underground publication. But they've really become very big in recent years. They boosted Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. And it's strange to me that Matt Taibbi still has a job there, honestly, and that they also brought Katie Halper aboard to do Useful Idiots. Do you have any thoughts on why a big media company like Rolling Stone would do that?
Because Matt has a huge platform and he gets clicks, and that's all they care about at the end of the day, is getting clicks and making ad revenue and making money. So most of the time in corporate media, that's a bad thing, almost always. But there are a few exceptions where even, let's not forget Glenn Greenwald, one of the only good remaining U.S. journalists. Yeah, we don't always agree, but he's still very brave, and I think he's done a lot of important work. Glenn used to do some work at The Guardian, which is awful. I mean, I often call it the Guardian of Blairism. It's totally a neoliberal rag. The Guardian was working very closely with the British military intelligence establishment to destroy Jeremy Corbyn, spreading all of these unsubstantiated, baseless rumors. And Glenn worked there for a bit. Now he's at The Intercept, which I have a lot of issues with as well. But because Glenn has his own platform, Glenn has a huge audience. And, without these big media personalities, these media platforms sometimes suffer. So, like I said, almost always it's a bad thing that they rely on ad revenue, because that means that you get clickbait, you get all this other nonsense. But sometimes it means that big media personalities can have some influence in these institutions. In the case of Matt Taibbi, he's a brilliant reporter. He's also an investigative reporter. I was talking about the importance of looking back to like Ramparts and I.F. Stone. There's a history on the left of investigative journalists who not only push a left-wing perspective, but also dig up new stories. And that's very important. And, a friend, Ken Klippenstein, does some good work on that too, but there are so few of us. And Matt is a brilliant investigative reporter, especially focused on the economy, which is something that, I don't do economic reporting at all. And I focus on foreign policy mostly, and he's brilliant. So I'm so glad that Matt has that platform at Rolling Stone. And Katie Halper's a friend, and her show has been great. I've been on it many times over the years. Her Katie Halper show, and then also Useful Idiots, which is awesome. I have to say, brilliant name. It's something that actually Max and I had been toying with originally before Moderate Rebels, but I'm glad they picked it because it's one of the few podcasts that I check out regularly.
So I know that you are in Nicaragua. Could you speak a little bit to the response to COVID-19 there and also throughout Latin America? Is it similar to what's been happening to the US and Western Europe, or is it a little bit different?
Very different. This is a very long and detailed discussion. So, I'm just going to give the idea in a nutshell. I'll say that anyone who wants to hear more about the coronavirus situation in Nicaragua, you could check out a recent Moderate Rebels episode that we did with Camilo Mejia, who is a Nicaraguan American anti-war veteran, actually. He was born in Nicaragua, but actually ended up serving in the U.S. military and went to Iraq and was radicalized and became an anti-imperialist, and a very interesting guy. And he was one of the first major conscientious objectors who ended up in prison. So anyway, we did an interview with him, and we talked about Nicaragua, the coronavirus situation. I don't want to spend 30 minutes getting into it because it's a complex issue. But what I'll say is that there's been a lot of propaganda, so much disinformation about Nicaragua because Nicaragua took the position of not shutting down the entire economy. A lot of places, probably half, I don't know the percentage, a lot of places are closed. A lot of restaurants were all closed. A lot of stores were closed. Of course, grocery stores and banks and some other places were open, but people still continued working because the thing about Nicaragua, which people have to keep in mind, is that this is a very poor country. Nicaragua is the second poorest country in the Western Hemisphere after Haiti. And like Haiti, it's been punished relentlessly for having a revolution. And in Nicaragua, around 70% of the population works in the informal sector, meaning they don't get paid a salary, they don't get a paycheck, and in many cases, most Nicaraguans don't even have a bank account. So if you shut down the economy and people have to stay at home, but these are people who live week by week working in small businesses, a majority of the Nicaraguan economy is what you could call small businesses, but not really in the sense of the U.S. when Democrats love to talk about small businesses. It really means like mom and pop people who, do artisanal skills and grow food and et cetera, different things, services, barbershops, et cetera, in Nicaragua. So that's the vast majority of the economy. So if the economy shuts down, these people have no way of surviving. So the Sandinista government and the health ministry, MINSA, worked together to create a plan that tried to balance shutting down the things that were not necessary, but also, and taking important health initiatives to protect people's health, but also at the same time, not completely shutting everything down, because the point they stressed is that in a country where so many people, the government has done what it can to try to lift people from poverty, but it's still a poor country. If they don't work for a month, 2 months, 3 months, there could be very serious problems with lack of food, other issues that could actually cause more deaths potentially than the virus itself. So there's been a lot of criticism for that. And of course, it's not perfect. But what's interesting is the same figures criticizing the Nicaraguan government relentlessly for its policies often are silent or in fact supportive of the policies in Brazil and the fascist Bolsonaro regime, which is responsible now for the worst pandemic, the worst crisis in Latin America, and the second worst in the world after good old USA. And Ecuador. Ecuador has gotten even less attention because in Brazil, I mean, Bolsonaro is just such a blatant fascist. He's just so ridiculous. I mean, he just gave a press conference. It's now known that Jair Bolsonaro has coronavirus. And he gave this press conference where he walked away from the press and took off his mask. And he said, masks are for homosexuals, but he said a much more insulting term. So, I mean, like, this guy is just such a blatant fascist that it's easy to point out how extreme the situation is there. But what's gotten much less attention is Ecuador, which has a neoliberal, total U.S. puppet regime that has been privatizing everything, pushing through IMF reforms. And the president has been totally in absentia, totally missing, Lenin Moreno, and a guy who is people often joke in Latin America that not only is he a traitor to his country, not only is he a traitor to Latin America, he's a traitor to his own name. This is a guy whose parents they were leftists who named him Lenin. And this guy, I mean, in Ecuador, the numbers rapidly change and the government's figures are very likely unreliable, as in many countries, including the US, of course. But in Ecuador, it's very likely that Ecuador has the highest deaths per capita in the world. So, yeah, the Nicaraguan situation is a complex one. And of course, there have been people who have died, for sure, as in any country. And that's absolutely tragic. But the idea that it's like some catastrophic dystopia is so ridiculous. And especially when you look at its neighbors. And last thing I'll say here is that we always have to compare apples to apples and not apples to oranges, because what's so often the case, including among some leftists in the global north, is they'll often compare Denmark or Sweden, or, by the way, which also took a very similar position to Nicaragua, or Norway. You know, many global north leftists love Scandinavian countries for having social democratic governments, even though many are either working with NATO or involved in imperialist structures, and also have massive fossil fuel reserves that they make money off of, which is, people will criticize Venezuela for being petropopulism, as Naomi Klein said, without talking about the massive reserves of oil used to fund social democracy and gas in Scandinavia, and arms sales. But anyway, the point is that frequently leftists in the global north will compare global north countries, former colonial countries in Europe, to countries in the global south that were colonized until recently and that are very poor, like Cuba and Nicaragua.
You did mention Ecuador, and I think it's important to speak about that a little bit, just because it is worth mentioning that Julian Assange was arrested in the Ecuadorian embassy. And could you speak a little bit more about what happened to Ecuador over recent years and how it was that he was seeking refuge in the Ecuadorian embassy and they ended up handing him over to the British authorities?
Absolutely. We have published several pieces chronicling the I don't want to say shift, because we now know that Lenin Moreno from the beginning has been very suspect, but we chronicled his horrific trajectory at the gray zone in the several articles that people can check out. But what's so incredible about the story of Lenin Moreno is that he had previously been a vice president under Rafael Correa, who was a leftist, social democratic, but also anti-imperialist leader in Ecuador, the first left-wing leader in decades, very important. And he wasn't this radical socialist who was expropriating rich people's wealth, but he drastically expanded social services, education, healthcare. Also, very importantly, he paid off Ecuador's debt. And of course, I'm sure your viewers know that debt has been used to entrap governments in Latin America, these kind of neo-colonial debt traps for decades. The IMF and the World Bank their strategy is not only to force austerity measures and privatization on Latin American governments through odious debt, but the strategy is also to prevent leftist governments in the future, if they come into power, from being able to govern effectively because they have this massive debt. And a great example of that is Argentina right now, which elected a left-wing president, Alberto Fernandez, and his vice president, Cristina de Kirchner, who was part of the Kirchnerist movement, kind of left movement in Argentina. And they have tens of billions of dollars of IMF debt because the former right-wing neoliberal president, Mauricio Macri, he took the largest IMF loan in history, over $50 billion. So now the left-wing government can't implement many of the policies that it wants because its currency has been devalued and it has to deal with this massive debt restructuring. Anyway, getting back to Ecuador, very similar situation in Ecuador now happening with Lenin Moreno otra vez, again, who is now taking more IMF loans and pushing austerity measures, which last October led to a massive uprising. So he, from the very beginning, has been suspect. Even though he was Correa's vice president, we now know from former Correa administration officials that he got some ideas that Lenin Moreno wasn't very trustworthy. And then what happened was Correa is now in exile. He's living in Belgium. He originally moved to Belgium because his wife is from Belgium. But what happened is, as with the rise of Lenin Moreno, it's clear that behind the scenes, like Luis Almagro, who was the foreign minister of the left-wing government under Pepe Mujica in Uruguay, he's now the head of the Organization of American States. Luis Almagro has become the worst kind of just mouth-foaming neoconservative right-wing gusanos. I mean, just like doing events with the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation and the U.S. government and Trump administration officials calling for the violent overthrow of the Venezuelan and Cuban governments. Just a mouth-foaming right-winger. Similarly, Lenin Moreno, but Luis Almagro had been part of a left-wing government, Pepe Mujica. And it's clear that Lenin Moreno is a similar kind of someone who was secretly kind of an asset working with the U.S., working with U.S. intelligence behind the scenes, and then kind of waiting, biding time. And then he became the candidate of the País Alliance Party of Correa and came into power, and then immediately purged Correa from his own party that he created, immediately threw the other vice president under Correa, Jorge Glass, in prison. And Jorge Glass has been suffering. He was on hunger strike on the verge of death, being tortured in prison. And then also he imposed like 20 different ridiculous charges on Correa, including like trying to link him to murder and all this ridiculous stuff. Just doing all these authoritarian measures, Lenin Moreno imposing these neoliberal reforms. But Ecuador, of course, surprise, surprise, when you push through all these neoliberal reforms, after you had a balanced budget, he starts to deal with all these economic problems. So as collateral, one of the ways to get this massive IMF bailout, not only was one of the preconditions imposing structural adjustment, which is always the case, austerity, but also the U.S. very clearly was telling Lenin Moreno, there's a lot of evidence of this that we detailed at the Gray Zone, that he has to give up Julian Assange. And he did so, and he violated the sovereignty of his own country in one of the only times in history when a government allowed a foreign government onto its own sovereign territory to arrest its own citizen who... This was not a case of extradition. This was a case of asylum. Julian Assange had been given asylum by the Ecuadorian government of Correa. And not only that, he was later given citizenship. Julian Assange was made into an Ecuadorian citizen. So an Ecuadorian citizen who was an asylee, who was given political refugee status on his own country's sovereign soil in the Ecuadorian embassy, had that violated and was arrested by the British government. This is such a massive crime. And it's directly related to the fact that he's just totally sold out his country to the U.S. and to the IMF specifically. He's also been in discussion of reopening the U.S. military base on the Galapagos Island, which Correa kicked out. So it's just neocolonialism. I mean, imperialism takes many different forms. This is just straight up neocolonialism, where he also, in the middle of this epidemic, this pandemic, Lenin Moreno, in a very little publicized move, and with very little coverage in even the Spanish language media, none in English, he delegated his responsibilities as president to the head of his cabinet. So it's really just a total puppet state at this point that doesn't even have a president. And I have a lot of friends and comrades in Ecuador who say that they're just like terrified because there's like it's a failed state. There's not even really a state, and they have per capita one of the worst coronavirus pandemic crises in the world right now.
And, right around the time that happened at the Ecuadorian embassy, you also had the situation at the Venezuelan embassy in Washington, D.C., and everything that happened there with the people who were allowed to be there by the legitimate Venezuelan government being kicked out and arrested. And it just makes you wonder if that political asylum or just embassy status and having that sovereign territory even matters anymore. If authoritarian governments like the U.S. and Britain can just walk in any of them at any time and do whatever they want.
Well, unfortunately, this isn't new. As we often point out, when I say we, I mean people broadly on the left outside of the Democratic Party. Trump's policies have been, for the most part, continuation of bipartisan policies of Obama, Bush, Clinton, Reagan. And this is a great example. It was under Bill Clinton during the NATO war to destroy Yugoslavia in the 1990s when NATO infamously bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade. And there are countless other examples of bombing embassies, of attacking foreign consulates. So this is not new, but it is pretty insane, the flagrant just violation of international and British law. And I didn't even mention the fact that we also know now, we've reported on at the Gray Zone, also the Spanish, like from Spain, the Spanish media has done a lot of reporting on this Spanish firm that was hired by the Ecuadorian government to provide security, which was then, there was a backdoor agreement made between the head of this Spanish security firm, who's named David Morales, and he is a former Spanish military intelligence officer who did a backdoor agreement through the private security firm of the super right-wing Republican mega donor billionaire Sheldon Adelson to make a deal with the CIA. And the CIA was using this Spanish cyber company contracted by the Ecuadorian government in order to spy on its own embassy and 24/7 give that video and audio footage over to the CIA. And the CIA was spying on the women's bathroom, was spying on Julian Assange 24/7 with video and audio. They reportedly dug through the garbage to get a diaper to prove that his son had the DNA of Julian Assange. I mean, just insane, just like ridiculous James Bond stuff, but without the sexiness. I mean, they're digging for a diaper. So that happened. And then there's just the fact that Julian Assange right now, we just have to say, this is a guy who his only so-called crime is publishing factual information. The case that was originally against him, which he was never actually criminally charged, was totally dropped. And we also know that this case that he wanted for questioning, he was not charged formally, he was just wanted for questioning. And he was always willing to be questioned, but Julian Assange said he would only be willing to be questioned in the embassy because he knew that if he agreed to go for questioning, that he would probably be extradited. And he turned out to be right about that. So anyway, that aside, Julian Assange is being tortured. That's not my opinion. That's the view of the leading UN expert on torture, the special rapporteur on torture, Nils Melzer, who has written numerous articles now saying that Julian Assange is being tortured, and more than 100 doctors and medical professionals published an open letter in Lancet, the leading medical journal, saying that Julian Assange is being tortured and could potentially even be on the verge of death. He doesn't even understand his own trial that's going on. It's a total show trial. So, I mean, this question started as violation of country sovereignty, but it's just gotten to the point where it's so criminal. And the last thing I'll say on this subject is that another form of attack on country sovereignty and international institutions, which is frankly mind-blowing. the attack on the World Health Organization is not surprising. People might remember going back to the Bush Jr. years. George W. Bush, not George H.W., George W. Bush, he also led this kind of crusade on the UN and multilateral institutions, led by many of these neoconservative figures like John Bolton, who were in his administration, Dick Cheney, who was the real president. And people don't remember that Bush, when he was in power and had significant control in Congress, they pushed through legislation that is known as the Hague Invasion Act. That's the informal name for it, but that's what it was called by the Republican Party and the media. The Hague Invasion Act says that if a U.S., not only a U.S. official, but if a U.S. ally is ever tried, like say an Israeli official, a British official, is ever tried at the International Criminal Court at The Hague in the Netherlands, that the U.S. reserves the unilateral right to militarily invade and liberate, in scare quotes, that war criminal from the docket. And so that goes back to the Bush years, but under Trump, it just becomes so cartoonish, where now Mike Pompeo, this just like cartoon villain from like a 50s James Bond movie. I mean, it's just so ridiculous. This guy, he is now threatening the family members of ICC staff. And Trump also recently called the ICC a threat to U.S. national security. It's so crazy, but it's all, and also in many ways, a continuation of what's been bipartisan policy for decades.
That's a fair point. And, one of the things about the Trump derangement syndrome that's been happening, in the Democratic Party and throughout the corporate media is that I think one effect of it is that the populace has largely forgotten about the crimes of not only Obama and Clinton, but also of George W. Bush. And it's pretty amazing just thinking back to how critical the media was of George W. Bush and his administration, and rightfully so, during those many years. And you think back to Stephen Colbert and Bill Maher, it seems as though, the Iraq War, the response to Hurricane Katrina, the torture at Abu Ghraib, just all of that has the Patriot Act, it's all seemed to have just disappeared out of people's minds. And now Bush and all of these neoconservatives are being applauded. They're hanging out with Ellen DeGeneres, but they're being celebrated as these heroes, these rational Republicans. I was bringing this up to a Democrat recently, and her response was, well, I always thought that George W. Bush was a nincompoop, but I didn't think he was a sociopath. Donald Trump is a sociopath. But I mean, this guy killed 1 million Iraqis or more, and just all of that, it seems to have gotten lost in this amnesia. And I don't know, it's very odd to me. And now we have, the Lincoln Project and them welcoming Dick Cheney to the resistance. It's very strange, isn't it?
Yeah, or what Will Menaker brilliantly called the Project for a New American Lincoln. I mean, just these same neocons, some of the worst war criminals on planet Earth, who have now been rehabilitated and become part of the great resistance against Trump. I have to say, look, Trump has done so many awful things. I don't need to go into that. Everyone knows that. He's horrible. He's a far-right bigot. He's a racist. He's overseen the highest. I mean, his tax cuts, first of all, was the highest wealth transfer from poor to rich in U.S. history. But then even beyond that, the most recent $8 trillion bailout. Oh my, it's just like, they're totally gutting the country at this point. I mean, it's like what all of the capitalist oligarchs did after overthrowing the Soviet Union, just looting the entire country. But I have to say, as awful as Trump is, I actually still think George W. Bush was even worse. And people don't, because they're so blinded by how bad Trump is symbolically, rhetorically, because all they care about is symbols and rhetoric and not policy. If you look at the policies that the Bush Jr. administration oversaw, it was a coup, basically. And the U.S. has never been a democracy. It was never a democracy, certainly for slaves, for Native Americans, for women until the early 20th century. But really, the few democratic and civil rights and civil liberties that existed were totally taken away in what was really a coup. And I think historians 100 years from now are going to look back at the rapid decline of the U.S. empire and the decline of the U.S. as a society, and they're really going to see the Bush years in some ways as more important, I think, than the Trump years. The Trump years are just accelerating that decline, putting it like pedal to the metal. But the Bush years were really when that was the moment where this country became, I mean, it never, again, it wasn't a democracy, but it became completely authoritarian. And people don't remember, first of all, it wasn't just after 9/11. We can't forget that there was a kind of legal coup where Bush didn't even win the election, but the court said he did. So there was this kind of legal coup. And then who was the real president? It was, of course, Dick Cheney. And let's be real about what the Bush administration was. You know, that movie Vice got a lot of criticism by people on the left. You know, I wrote about it saying I think it's actually a good movie. I had some criticisms, but it's a pretty good movie. And what it gets right, so it gets some things wrong, but one thing it gets brilliantly right is that Dick Cheney was the man in charge, and he was using Bush as his vehicle to get power, and behind him were just these hyper imperialists. That's what neoconservatives are. In some ways, neocon is kind of like a euphemism. These are just like blood curdling war criminals who they are ideological imperialists who want to exert military U.S. power around the world. They deeply believe in the U.S. empire. As Max Boot famously said in the Bush era, he said, we need to bring back the I word. We're imperialists. Imperialism's good. It brings stability, blah, blah, blah. But anyway, the point I'm getting at is that, so there was this coup to basically install Cheney and Bush, but Cheney. And then after 9/11, they just totally destroyed civil liberties and pushed through. I mean, let's not forget the Patriot Act, which most people in Congress never even read because it was thousands of pages. They had that written. Like, they didn't write that in 2 weeks. I mean, this was just like every single authoritarian measure that the most insane, blood-curdling neocons that I'm talking about wanted to implement, and they just did it. And that was a coup against the very few remaining elements of American democracy. And now the leader who oversaw that, and then, of course, not even to mention, of course, the Iraq War is such a monumental crime, million dead Iraqis, giving rise to Al-Qaeda, setting the stage for ISIS. It's just so, the crimes of George Bush, it's difficult to overstate how insane those crimes were. And of course, the Cheney crew. So hopefully, I think in 100 years, if the planet still exists, if life still exists and climate change doesn't kill us all, I think people are going to go back and see that as awful as Trump is, Bush was just like, oh, it's difficult to be worse than Bush was.
Well, on that note, I did want to discuss something that's been in the news recently, and that is Bountygate. And of course, that centers on the fact that we are still in Afghanistan. Since the first year of the Bush presidency, we've been in Afghanistan. And there was this allegation that came out from the intelligence community that Russia was offering bounties for, I guess, people allied with the Taliban to murder U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan. The Congress did introduce legislation, and Democrats partnered with Liz Cheney, actually, on this legislation that would keep troops in Afghanistan.
This is a transparent attempt by the U.S. so-called intelligence community, spies, and the military-industrial complex, and also the Afghan government, which is a puppet government. It has very little support. And the Afghan government recognizes that if the U.S. were to withdraw its troops and also the other NATO troops, that it would pretty quickly collapse. So the Afghan government, with the leadership of the CIA and other U.S. spies, began pushing this very dubious story that was entirely sourced, by the way, to U.S. anonymous intelligence officials, which means CIA spies. You can see that very clearly. Just read the New York Times articles, the Washington Post articles. It's always attributed to anonymous spies. And their attempt was to get the Congress to vote to prevent the Trump administration from withdrawing troops. Again, like I said, I don't need to get into this a million times. Trump is absolutely awful. Almost everything he's done has been completely atrocious. But at the same time, a broken clock is right twice a day. And he does have this instinct of trying to remove troops from Afghanistan. Of course, he's really dumb. And he often, the neocons he surrounded himself with, and just these just imperialist, just loons like Mike Pompeo and before him John Bolton, are able to kind of dangle a carrot before Trump and push him in the direction they want. So Trump has continued to delay that, but there have been important peace breakthroughs recently in Afghanistan, and there were talks, very serious moves to withdraw thousands of U.S. troops. Not all U.S. troops. Of course, we should be demanding all U.S. troops to leave and all U.S. military bases, but there was a move toward removing some, and that really scared intelligence agencies in the US and other NATO countries and the Afghan government. So we published an article by Gareth Porter, just kind of a brilliant journalist, it's about the gray zone, just kind of clinically looking through how this disinformation campaign worked. And it fell apart so quickly. It fell apart in like 5 days, but they got what they wanted, which is what you just mentioned. They got Democrats in Congress to join hands with Republicans, including Liz Cheney herself, to vote to put barriers to prevent the U.S. from the Trump administration from withdrawing U.S. troops in Afghanistan. So they got the intended goal in record time, and the media narrative fell apart, and no one's going to remember it in a month.
And it is amazing how transparent it was too, because it was just very obvious that the entire goal was to keep troops there, and that you had the story pop up so quickly, then immediately have the legislation ready to introduce, and then the story collapses and falls apart shortly thereafter.
Well, briefly here, you know, this is how the media works, especially in the US, but in many countries. And I'm not going to do some kind of rosy retrospection about how in the 60s the media was so great and fair. No, as brilliant scholars like Michael Parenti showed in his book, as Edward Herman and Chomsky famously showed, the media, going back to every single major U.S. war, has always played the role of the handmaiden of empire, stenographer for empire, going back to the Spanish-American War and the yellow journalism of Randolph Hearst and these people. But I do have to say that talking about, you know, the Bush years, the kind of coup that happened, the complete authoritarian shift, totally authoritarian shift of the U.S. government, there really has been a total breakdown of news to such a degree that the kind of tactics we saw in the lead up to the Iraq War, which again, they aren't new, but they weren't as prevalent as they are now. Basically, every single story in the corporate media about foreign issues is just a press release from the CIA or a U.S. intelligence agency, the military intelligence wing or something like that. I mean, it's absolutely crazy. And part of that is also related to what we were talking about earlier, the destruction of media, not just progressive media, but media platforms have been hemorrhaging money. Everything moved online. Social media basically took a lot of readers and the audience away from network, you know, TV networks, and newspapers have been hemorrhaging money. So instead of actually doing investigative journalism, which is very expensive, they just brought on these people who, okay, they live in like an armored fortress in Baghdad or in Beirut, and then they just get fed press releases from their air-conditioned office, and they just rewrite what the CIA tells them. And there's this kind of reciprocal relationship, which you can very clearly see with David Ignatius at the Washington Post, with pretty much everyone at the New York Times. You can even see it with some reporters who kind of will sometimes be a little more critical, like Ackerman at the Daily Beast, some people at The Guardian, who will sometimes kind of criticize the national security state, but they're also kind of being fed scoops from the national security state when it's politically convenient, especially when they want to go after Trump. Because Trump, you know, there's this kind of internal war going on, and it's not because he's some great opponent of the national security state. It's because they have their own, every state has its own internal interest within the ruling class, internal fights within the ruling class. But anyway, the point is that basically every story that you read in corporate media right now, you don't even have to be like super knowledgeable of the topic. Just go through the story and see how many times they say US officials said, anonymous senior level CIA officials or intelligence officials said, or military officials. It's every single story. And it just shows how totally propagandized we are 24/7 on a daily basis. It's really crazy. And I do have to say, there are, of course, every country has propaganda. State media outlets, of course, push propaganda. But I really do think it's true that the American people in the US are probably the most propagandized people on earth.
Well, Ben, something else I wanted to ask you about briefly, because it's been such a big story in the news, is the recent arrest of Ghislaine Maxwell. And this actually came pretty quickly after the release of a new Netflix documentary about Jeffrey Epstein. I recently watched it, and I thought it was amazing how redacted it was, insofar as there was no mention or even allegation that it could have been any kind of intelligence operation, or Ghislaine Maxwell's father's connection to intelligence. That was just not mentioned at all, or the allegations around Les Wexner. So it was pretty infuriating to watch, actually. And even with Ghislaine Maxwell being arrested, and again the fact that her father what had connections to intelligence and had a very strange sort of death, as he was in a lawsuit with Seymour Hersh, who had exposed him. Do you think that it's possible that through any of this that there will be that story could actually break into the mainstream, that there could be any sort of consideration by the populace about the very real possibility that there was this international pedophile blackmail ring? Or do you think that it's really just going to be this meme, Epstein didn't kill himself, Ghislaine Maxwell didn't kill herself?
Well, Epstein didn't kill himself. Everyone knows that. I mean, come on, it's just so clear. But a few things. For anyone who wants to really get into detail on this, I recommend True and On. Great podcast. I'm a regular listener. And I definitely have Epstein brain. I mean, it's so crazy how deep this stuff goes. Now, I don't want to make predictions about the future. I'll just say what my feeling is going to be. I highly doubt that anything substantive will come out. If Ghislaine Maxwell survives, which we'll see. I mean, she could be suicided too. But if she survives, I highly doubt that there's going to be anything that comes out publicly. There's been some kind of tabloid speculation that she's going to spill the beans. No, there's too many powerful people involved. So if she doesn't get suicided, there's going to be some kind of backroom deal, and maybe she'll get a slap on the wrist. But there are way too many powerful people involved in this. And as for Epstein and the links to intelligence, this is a matter of fact and public record at this point. Few things. My colleague Aaron Mate did a piece at the Gray Zone on his show, great show, Pushback, you can check out on YouTube. And he pointed out that there is an FBI document that was involved in the first trial against Epstein before he definitely didn't kill himself. And in that FBI document, they say that Epstein was providing intelligence to the FBI. So we know that he was an FBI informant at the very least. We also know that he used to brag in the 90s. This was reported in a British newspaper at the time, that he was working with the CIA. We also know that Jeffrey Epstein somehow at a party in London was reported having a New York police issued gun, which they questioned, how did he even get that into the UK, yet alone how did he get a New York police issued gun? And then there's the fact that Alex Acosta, the former U.S. U.S. attorney who oversaw the case against Epstein, the sweetheart deal where Epstein basically went to like overnight camp, it wasn't even real prison, and then just got off on it completely, where Alex Acosta was told to give Epstein a sweetheart deal because, quote, He belongs to intelligence. So we have all of this evidence showing this. And then we also have Consortium News has done a pretty good piece looking into this. And I have to give a shout out to Consortium News. I forgot to mention they do really good investigative journalism on the left. They published a piece in which a former Israeli military intelligence official acknowledged that Epstein was working with Israeli military intelligence. And then, of course, Ghislaine Maxwell's father, everyone knows, was working with Israeli intelligence. And you mentioned his mysterious death. He was actually apparently trying to blackmail the Israeli government at the time when he died. So, I mean, if you're a spy and you try to blackmail the spies, that never turns out well for you. So, unfortunately, no. I highly doubt that we're going to get answers about a lot of this stuff in the near future. And frankly, I think if we ever get answers, it's going to have to be like a Sykes Pico thing. Because what's interesting is people talk about Sykes Pico, which is the famous 1916 agreement in which the British and French foreign ministers literally sat down with a map and carved up the Middle East and said that these are the former parts of the Turkish Ottoman Empire, and we're going to get this, and you're going to get that, and we're going to get that. Well, the Russian Tsar was partially involved, although as like a minor figure, and the Russian Empire benefited from this Sykes-Picot Agreement. And then what happened was in 1917 with the Bolshevik Revolution, it was the Bolsheviks that raided the Winter Palace. They raided all of the Tsar's documents, and they found all of these documents and they published it in Pravda, exposing Sykes-Picot. So I think that, not to get people's hopes up too much, if there's ever some kind of revolution or something in the U.S., we'll finally get access to these documents about the sex trafficking ring that absolutely existed as a form of blackmail. So U.S., Israeli, Saudi, British intelligence services could blackmail the most powerful people in the world. It's real, yes.
And it is also worth mentioning a couple other recent suspicious deaths. One was in April, someone who Maria Farmer had called the Holy Grail of the Epstein investigation. That was Andy Stewart, who I guess was a chef for her father. He died suddenly. Also, there was a suspicious death of Steve Bing, who had relationship with Bill Clinton, and who Bill Clinton actually tweeted a little eulogy about, and some have theorized it may have had a connection to Epstein as well. He jumped off a building in Los Angeles pretty recently. So,
I also found this insane detail, and then with the comrades over at Truanon parsed out some more details. Speaking of Ghislaine Maxwell, and this is like right up my alley as someone focusing on imperialism in Latin America. Ghislaine Maxwell claimed at a party which was attended by Prince Andrew. This was reported on in The Observer when it was a New York tabloid in the 2000s, well before Epstein was suicided and before people knew his name, and before he was a household name. This article reported that Ghislaine Maxwell was bragging at this party with Prince Andrew again that she in Colombia had flown a Black Hawk helicopter, and we know that she had a helicopter's license, and we know that Ghislaine Maxwell did fly helicopters. That's actually kind of plausible. And that she claimed that she shot a bazooka into a so-called terrorist camp in Colombia. Now, the so-called terrorists, which are not terrorists in Colombia, are revolutionary socialist guerrilla groups, mostly the FARC and the ELN. There are some other groups who are socialists, mostly poor people, landless peasants who took up arms against the far-right authoritarian regime in Colombia. It's not really a real democracy. So that is a really crazy story. But then we looked into it more. For instance, I found out that Pastrana, who is a former right-wing president of Colombia, he was friends with Epstein, and he actually issued an apology because there were reports that he was actually meeting with Epstein, also with Bono, one of the most insufferable neoliberal entrepreneur or whatever humanitarians on earth, whose music also just sucks completely. But so Bono, Pastrana, the right-wing Colombian president, and Epstein were together. And so Pastrana issued this apology for being on Epstein's plane. He claimed, of course, nothing happened. True, likely story. And Pastrana, where did he issue that apology from? He issued it on Twitter from the occupied Golan Heights, the Israel-occupied Golan Heights, which is Syrian sovereign territory. So it raises so many questions what he was doing there. And then even beyond that, the folks at True Anon found out that there was also, at the same time when Ghislaine Maxwell was bragging about this, the Bill Clinton administration oversaw the sale of Black Hawk helicopters to Colombia when Pastrana was president. So honestly, I think that's a true story. I'm convinced that Ghislaine Maxwell flew a U.S. Black Hawk helicopter provided by the Clinton administration to Colombia and attacked socialist guerrillas, which just says everything about like the capitalist ruling class.
You have it all there in a nutshell. It is also worth mentioning, too, that Epstein was a, quote, enthusiastic member of the Trilateral Commission and Council on Foreign Relations. So, Ben, yeah, I know we don't have much time left. I did just want to quickly talk about the Green Party nomination that's happening this weekend. I saw in passing on Twitter that you referred to Howie Hawkins, who is pretty much expected to be coronated unless something goes awry. You referred to him as a soft imperialist. I know you also spoke up when Twitter had silenced him or had said that he was impersonating himself. So just overall, I'd be curious what led you to call him a soft imperialist, and just any other thoughts that you may have about the Green Party nomination.
Well, this gets into a very long discussion about the state of the U.S. left and Syria and Libya and Venezuela and Nicaragua and a lot of issues. It's everyone who knows me and knows my work knows that I'm very critical of the U.S. left for very frequently being soft on imperialism. So it's not like I'm saying that he's unique in that regard. And that would be not only in terms of Syria, but especially in terms of Nicaragua, where in 2018 there was a very violent right-wing coup attempt backed by the Trump administration, led by, frankly, a lot of terrorists, people who killed and tortured Sandinistas, including people I know who had family members and friends killed. They burnt down the houses of Sandinistas. They marked the homes of who is a Sandinista. I mean, just like fascist terrorist behavior. And then a lot of people on the U.S. left portrayed this as a great uprising, a left-wing uprising, an anti-neoliberal uprising against the so-called dictatorship of Daniel Ortega and the Sandinistas. Absolutely preposterous, absolutely ridiculous. Syria, I mean, whatever, I'm not going to get into all of that. That's a long discussion that we can have another time. So, unfortunately, look, Howie Hawkins has, on some issues, a really great history. He's really good at anti-racism, which is a very important issue that a lot of people on the left, including the kind of Trotskyite social democratic left, are often very bad at. So in that sense, he actually deserves credit because he really understands how important it is, how the struggle against white supremacy in the context of U.S. history specifically. So he also has a really good labor history. But look, Howie Hawkins really dropped the ball in the past several years on a lot of these issues. On Syria, he posted a lot of really horrible stuff. And again, we don't have time getting into it, but portraying what I would argue was an imperialist proxy war to defeat a sovereign global south formerly colonized nation and restore a puppet regime by destroying the state and either installing an Islamist regime that would be a puppet of Gulf dictatorships or would frankly be a failed state Afghanistan style ruled by ISIS or Al-Qaeda, which was also came close to actually happening. People portraying that as a progressive revolution when the CIA, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey were the main forces waging war on this country, this independent sovereign nation in the global south, with a nationalist government that refuses to recognize Israel, one of the only countries in the region that's not a theocratic dictatorship, which is a secular state, and which refuses to normalize relations with Israel. Anyway, so there's the issue of Syria, which, frankly, I think is a very key issue, which we'll get to in a second. And then there's the issue of Russiagate. And, Howie Hawkins made comments with an interview with you. Primo Nutmeg is a good channel. You can take that as an endorsement if you want it, which you probably don't. But, I mean, you have a lot of great interviews, so I'm not in any way And you interview a variety of people, which I respect, but his comments on Russiagate were pretty atrocious, frankly, really giving into Russiagate, talking about how Putin this and Putin that. And then he did issue an apology, which is good, but this gets to my main point. Look, I have voted for the Green Party in numerous presidential elections. So I've never voted for a Democrat in a presidential election, and I'm not going to. I mean, this is an awful, abysmal party. And there's not really many differences between the Democrats and the Republicans on most important issues. But at the same time, look, what is the point of having a third party if all you're going to argue for is redistributive social democratic economic policies, which I 100% support, but then you just take the kind of soft imperialist line? And my view is that the point of running these third party candidates is to actually provide a challenge to the bipartisan dictatorship of the two-party, one-party state that the U.S. has. And unfortunately, not just Howie Hawkins, but many people in the Green Party have really been weak on this issue. And this also goes back to Bernie Sanders and many people in that camp. Look, this is a whole long conversation which we don't have time to get into, but as people, I as a U.S. citizen, I mean, I don't live in the U.S. anymore, but I'm a U.S. citizen, and I'm never, you can't, that's not something, even if I gave up my U.S. citizenship, which is a kind of dumb performative thing, I'm still an American. I was like, that's something that it's part of like a political identity, and it's an issue we always have to, we have a political responsibility by virtue of being people from citizens of the largest empire on earth and the largest empire in history, which has 804 military bases, and which not only through its military, but through economics, through the IMF, through the World Bank, through the dictatorship of the global dollar as the de facto global currency reserve and trade reserve, and the petrodollar, the main currency for selling oil, we have a responsibility, especially as people on the left, to work to demolish, deconstruct, abolish that empire. And that needs to be at the forefront of our politics, I think. I think it's one of the key contradictions as people, as leftists who are U.S. citizens or non-citizens in the U.S. So I think that if you're a third party and you're trying to challenge that, it needs to be one of the most important issues. And it's not just a matter of later apologizing and taking a better position. Howie Hawkins has since taken a better position in some of these issues, but the point is that it needs to be a fundamental priority. And this is a fundamental issue with the DSA too. I know a lot of good people and comrades in Democratic Socialists of America. I also know a lot of horrible people who have odious politics, but DSA is very complicated. It's an extremely contradictory organization with so many internal contradictions that don't make any sense, that are going to implode one day, unfortunately. But I wrote an article about it, and I was soft in my criticism of DSA, even though I have very many criticisms, especially talk about Nicaragua and works with, in their collaboration with people who were funded by the National Endowment for Democracy, a CIA cutout by Ronald Reagan. Anyway, to keep this shorter, the DSA, they had this study that showed a survey of people's priorities, and at the bottom of the list was imperialism and also immigrants' rights, which are closely related. And look, I know a lot of people who have pretty good views in DSA who are anti-war and anti-imperialist, which is not necessarily the same thing, by the way. But the thing is, because you can oppose some wars but still support empire in other ways. Anyway, the point is that in terms of DSA here, that the point is it needs to, not only do you have to like take rhetorically good positions, but it needs to be a major priority in understanding how capitalism functions. The last thing I'll just say here is that imperialism is the highest monopoly stage of capitalism. After the imperialists carve up the world, which they did in the 19th century at the Berlin Conference, the European powers literally carved up Africa with a map. And after the entire world was carved up, then it becomes a matter of inter-imperialist competition. And that led to World War I, to World War II, the Cold War. And then we got to the point where we're in such a stage of monopoly capitalism, because anyone who reads Marx, anyone who just thinks about capitalism understands that it has an inherent tendency toward monopolization. That's very clear in internal industries with monopolies in countries, but also that happens at the international stage. And we used to live in the stage of inter-imperialist competition. Lenin, which he famously wrote about in Imperialist, the Highest Age of Capitalism. World War I was interpreted as an inter-imperialist war for the control of empire and specifically Africa. So W.E. Du Bois famously said that it was a war to carve up Africa, which it partially was, of course, also to carve up the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But then what happens is, over time, even empire monopolizes. And the U.S., throughout the Cold War, monopolized empire, and even the former European empires became kind of Caesarides in some ways. They're still empires, but they kind of became imperial, kind of like subjects in some ways. Not subjects, but like extensions of the U.S. empire. And then you get the end of the Cold War, the destruction of the socialist bloc. George H.W. Bush, former CIA director turned president, I mean, the perfect symbol of the victory of capitalism through this CIA covert war. The capitalism's invisible army, the CIA, waged this war against socialism around the world, and it has the victory of George H.W. Bush, this oil baron who declares the New World Order, which is not some Illuminati conspiracy. It's the U.S. empire being the international hegemon with no challenge to it. And that since 1991, that has been slowly breaking apart and declining. But there are now a lot of people on the so-called left who see the decline of that system as something that is bad, and that gives rise to the softer left, but people like the anti-China fundamentalists. Who's the guy who he's just become so unhinged on Twitter that he just like calls China Nazi, but like he's calls himself a socialist, whatever. I mean, this DC think tanker. I mean, there really is this kind of social democratic, soft imperialist left that's growing, and it has some supporters in the Green Party too, who see they say that Russia is the new fascist power, and we have to unite with the European Union, which, by the way, has never had issues with fascism, and in NATO, which from its very foundation, one of the founding members of NATO was a fascist dictatorship in Portugal, and has supported former Nazi collaborators and fascists since its entire history, through Operation Gladio, using them against socialists. So now there's this new attempt by especially people like the soft social democratic left, but even some anarchists who they're so terrified of the Russian boogeyman and China that they think we have to unite with the European Union and NATO, which are objectively the most pro-fascist institutions on earth. So anyway, I mean, that's a whole long debate, but that's my view. I mean, I just kind of summarize it in however many minutes there, and I think that unfortunately the Green Party has not done a good job of articulating that position. I'll make an exception. Ajamu Baraka is one of the best people on the U.S. left. He really gets it deeply at a fundamental level. His politics are really centered on that, understanding how key anti-imperialism is to being an anti-capitalist in the age of monopoly imperial capital. And I think Ajamu Baraka should be the future of the U.S. Green Party, and not people like Howie Hawkins. Unfortunately, we have to look at what happened in Europe to the Green Party throughout Europe and also Canada. And there's now a debate going on in Canada, and I think actually the candidate right now trying to be the leader is amazing, and we should support him, Dimitri Lascaris. He gets it too. He fundamentally he's deeply an anti-imperialist, pro-Palestinian activist, pro-Venezuela solidarity activist. He gets it. But then you look at the current people in charge of the Canadian Greens or the Greens in Europe, and they have taken this position I was just talking about. They understand that there is a crisis of neoliberalism and a crisis of climate change. So what they're doing is trying to save imperialism by creating a new pro-environmental green rebranding of empire, by trying to save the European Union and NATO, and saying that and China and Russia and Venezuela and Iran are horrible. They all rely on oil. Well, not China, but They all rely on oil exports, and this is petropopulism. And we need to create a new Green New Deal, which I support, but a certain kind of Green New Deal that is anti-imperialist. But no, we need a Green New Deal through the European Union, through NATO, without talking about the military, which the U.S. military is the largest institutional consumer of oil on Earth. So I hit a lot of points there, but fundamentally, my critique of Howie Hawkins is not even about him as an individual. It's about the fact that he, being the candidate of the Green Party, shows that they're trying to go in that direction that the European Greens have already gone in. Which, sure, it's helped the Greens win some votes in Europe, but at what expense? At the expense of abandoning that core mission that I think really needs to be the fundamental mission of the left in the entire world in the 21st century.
And unfortunately, there's a whole nother dimension to what's going on where every other candidate who's running against Howie Hawkins is alleging that the nomination has been rigged. This goes into partnerships between the Hawkins campaign and national co-chairs. Also, because the Green Party is so small, I think that maybe friendships are involved in some issues too. I mean, I agree with you on Ajamo Baraka's politics. Unfortunately, he's been actually supportive of Howie Hawkins as a candidate. I think that's honestly because he's friends with Margaret Flowers and Kevin Zeese, who essentially Margaret Flowers was in charge of the Draft Howie campaign, and Kevin Zeese is his communications director. I wish that there would be more people outspoken, not just about Howie Hawkins' politics, but also about the rigging that's going on. And honestly, I'm kind of surprised that there hasn't been much attention by the independent media on all of the controversies that have been surrounding the Green Party nomination. There have been, a few people, Jimmy Dore, Nico House has actually focused on it quite a bit. George Galloway has spoken about Hawkins a bit more recently. Why do you think it is the case that the left party, the Green Party, isn't getting more focus? And when you have every candidate but one saying that the nomination is rigged, wouldn't that be a bigger story in the left?
I think this is fundamentally related to the issue I was trying to get at, which I was trying to stress is not just about Howie Hawkins as a person. Is that what is the direction of the Green Party in the future? I didn't even mention the fact that, look, I've acknowledged that Howie Hawkins did some good work, but the reason I made that whole long tangent is because Howie Hawkins comes from a particular tradition coming out of the Socialist Party USA. The Socialist Party USA was founded by Max Shachtman, who should be, every time someone on the left in the U.S. hears his name, they should spit. I mean, this is one of the most despicable, vile people in the history of the U.S. left, the worst kind of turncoat. Max Shachtman was one of the Trotskyites who became a total neocon, who supported the Bay of Pigs invasion. He supported the Korean War, and he gave birth to this kind of... He represents that legacy of the Trotskyites who became neocons. Bayard Rustin was also one of the main leaders of the Socialist Party USA. Bayard Rustin he was working with the CIA. So this is what the figures we're talking about. This is the kind of Cold War left we're talking about. Unfortunately, I'm not accusing Howie Hawkins of secretly harboring those views. I'm saying that he comes out of that tradition of the U.S. left. And so does the DSA, by the way. But that's a whole long conversation. Anyway, the point is, the reason I mention all that history is because it's become clear to me that the Green Party is trying to go in that direction. Sometimes I call it the kind of the respectable left, where you tone down certain views because you know that you're going to be criticized as a tanky or whatever the stupid smear is, the smear de jour is, because you want to get more respect in mainstream progressive circles, whatever. That is, I think, related. That fight over the direction of the future of the Green Party is, I think, related to what you were just talking about. And I have to say that by saying that I have nothing but love for Kevin Zeese and Margaret Flowers and many of these other comrades. And in the case of those two, I mean, I respect them so much because they were involved in defending the Venezuelan embassy. So, look, I'm not involved in the internal Green Party dynamics, so I understand that there are people like them and others who have spent years organizing in the Green Party, and I respect their work, and I wish them nothing but success. All I'm saying is that I, as an individual who have never had an institutional relation with the Green Party, even though I have voted for them in the past, I think that I'm kind of disappointed in the direction I've seen them going in. I think the direction they should be, and I understand that Ajamu Baraka endorsed Howie Hawkins. I get that. So, this is a complex discussion, but I think someone like Ajamu Baraka needs to be the future. And also there's the issue of whiteness too, which, of course we should have white candidates. I'm not saying we shouldn't have white candidates, but the Green Party is a very white party, and we need more people of color to be candidates, especially people like Ajamu Baraka. So I thought that the Stein-Baraka slate was a pretty good one. And I thought picking Baraka was a brilliant move. And I think that that's a move that the Green Party, that not only because of all the issues I'm talking about, but just because of strategy, that needs to be the direction the Green Party goes in the future. And I'm worried that it's kind of going down the same path of the European Greens, which all we have to do is look at the European Greens and see that it has been pretty bad.
So Ben, I know we've gone about an hour longer than I said we would. Do you have just a couple minutes for just a couple quick patron questions?
For sure.
Cool. So one patron question comes from Christopher. He says, Ben, I noticed that often you make overarching statements about self-proclaimed anarchists on Twitter. I would like to know what your opinion is on historical anarchism and how it has been used as a countervailing force against fascism and corporate totalitarianism, and if you see any use for the principles of anarchism, i.e. mutual aid, horizontal organizing, etc.
Absolutely. There are some good things that anarchism absolutely has to offer, as with anything on the left. Even social democracy has some good things to offer. The issue when I'm criticizing anarchists is I've been using the term anarcho-neocon more, and people laugh and say what that is, but to try to be more specific. So, because I have, this sounds like one of those stupid, like, I have friends who are black or whatever. Like, I have friends and comrades who are anarchists who I respect, even though we disagree in some issues. The issue is that there's a fundamental line. We can disagree in some issues of tactics and things, but there is a significant chunk of anarchists and what you could say ultra-leftists. I get that's ultra-left is usually used as a criticism. You could say left communists. They're libertarian socialists, the term people use. There is a significant chunk, I'm not going to say all at all, certainly not all, definitely not all, but there's a significant chunk of these people who objectively side with imperialism. So when it comes to the coup in Venezuela, they say Maduro is an authoritarian dictator and we support the left opposition against Maduro. Look, I've spent a lot of time in Venezuela. There is no significant left opposition. I'm sorry, that's just the reality. And you might know some person on Twitter who, by the way, is tweeting in English for some reason or writing articles in English in a country where only the bourgeoisie speaks English, only like the elite speak English. Certainly working class labor organizers working in co-ops don't speak English. And there are co-ops. And look, some of the people in the cooperatives in Venezuela might have some critiques of the government, but they're hardcore Chavistas who support the government through and through at the end of the day. And they understand that this idea of like there's some kind of left opposition against the Chavistas or the Sandinistas here in Nicaragua, they don't exist. I'm sorry. There are a very tiny little slew of people who are writing in English for an English language audience, who are from the bourgeoisie and often don't even live in Venezuela or Nicaragua or Cuba. They live in Europe or the US, and they're part of this. I mean, look, here's an example of this. In Venezuela, the so-called left opposition has a voice called Aporrea. Aporrea was founded by Chavistas who later became disenchanted and they moved to the left, many Trotskyites, some anarchists. One of the main leaders of that movement last year in February, when Juan Guaido, this US puppet, declared himself fake president, one of the main leaders of the fake left opposition met with Juan Guaido, and actually two leaders of the so-called left opposition who have no institution, they have no power in Venezuela whatsoever. They certainly don't have power in co-ops or the organized working class. So that is a non-insignificant number of anarchists and libertarian socialists, and people really need to understand that. Now, there also are more libertarian-leaning Chavistas who work in co-ops. That's great. I've seen them with my own eyes. It's great. I've been to some of the co-ops, San Agustin, others. There's a great co-op called Maisal, which is a great co-op. And like I said, they might have some criticism of the government because they're kind of more anarchist leaning, but they're still the hardcore Chavistas who at the end of the day support the elected government of Maduro. And more importantly, because Maduro is not in charge of everything. This idea that that he's a dictator, it's so, people don't understand how states work. In fact, Maduro is probably not the most powerful person in Venezuela. I'll just say that. There are some powerful people in the government who have just as much, if not more power as Maduro. And then there's the issue of Syria, and it's the same kind of thing. Look, I get why people might have critiques of these states who certainly sometimes have authoritarian measures, but we also have to understand, not necessarily excusing them, we have to understand why they exist. Why? First of all, Cuba is a good example of this. Cuba has internal elections, and that's almost never discussed on the U.S. left, including especially by people who criticize Cuba and call it a so-called dictatorship. Okay, Cuba doesn't have presidential elections, but the U.S. doesn't really have presidential elections either. I mean, and not that anarchists are defending U.S. presidential elections and the farce of so-called U.S. bourgeois democracy, but also there's this fetishization of elections as some kind of democratic measure. I would argue that Cuba is actually much more democratic by any small d anarchist definition of the term. In terms of the power that working class people have in society, they have much more power in Cuba than they have not only in Western capitalist countries, but including in social democratic countries in Scandinavia. So the point is that there's this kind of absolutist view that sees any kind of institutional, including especially state power, as inherently bad, but it doesn't take into account imperialism and sabotage. If Cuba just got rid of some of these so-called more authoritarian measures, it would be overthrown. The U.S. government, and it's not a cop-out, this is 100% the reality. The person who has had more assassination attempts against him in U.S. history, in world history, is Fidel Castro, who had, we know of, at least 638 assassination attempts by U.S. intelligence agencies. Just the U.S. It's not counting other countries. So, and there were so many terror attacks by U.S.-backed terrorists like Posada Carriles. There was acts of sabotage, economic sabotage. There was an economic blockade which still exists. This is also true, by the way, of the Eastern European countries that had socialist governments, including Yugoslavia, which was slightly more libertarian leaning, if you will, and the Soviet Union. And we have to be able to acknowledge the many accomplishments the Soviet Union had while acknowledging the weaknesses and the shortcomings rather. And we also have to acknowledge the degree to which, look, sure, you could say the DDR, East Germany had all these bad things, whatever. But we also have to be able to acknowledge it in the context of what I was talking about earlier, a literal terrorist war funded by the CIA and the capitalist West German government, literally arming former Nazis who had fought in the SS and supported Adolf Hitler. And then what happens after World War II? 70% of the West German government, of the Justice Department, is former Nazis, and they have Nazi death squads trying to overthrow violently, using acts of terror, the East German socialist government and poison school children's milk. That a lot of look, I've talked about this before. I used to be an anarchist, and I'm not trying to be condescending. It was when I was in college. It was in high school. I was in high school during Occupy, and then college, and I was into anarchism. That was kind of in vogue in the U.S. left. I was politicized by Chomsky and Howard Zinn and these more anarchisty thinkers. But over time, I'm not trying to condescend, just frankly educating myself more and learning this history, you realize how hard it is to actually have a functioning socialist government, socialist society. And look, I'll just be real here. The only socialist societies that have existed in modern history, if we're not fetishizing in some ways the horrors of feudal society and pre-feudal society where people died when they were 30 or 40 years old. Sure, they had no state, but they didn't have much of a society either. Look, we can look at the Spanish Revolution, and sure, there are some good things to celebrate, but also It was defeated by fascism. It lasted for a few years. They lost. They failed. And unfortunately, there are so many other examples of these anarchist examples failing, because the reality is that anarchists, once they overthrow the state or whatever, or have a revolution, they very quickly realize, it dawns on them, if you don't have a state, if you don't have a standing army, which is not volunteer, which is a mandatory army, then you're not going to be able to defend that state very quickly, because you're going to be invaded by imperialist capitalist countries overnight or very quickly. And at the end of the day, you're going to have to either have state mechanisms to defend those socialist gains, as would happen in the Soviet Union. They were invaded by 22 imperialist countries, and there was a massive war in which the genocidal, anti-Semitic, czarist white army, which included many proto-fascist elements, was fighting against the Reds, and a huge section of the anarchists joined the Bolsheviks because they realized that if they wanted to defend the socialist gains as workers that they had, they did actually have to have some state mechanisms, because the choice was the destruction of their anarchist society and the victory of fascism, or the acknowledgement that you have to have some kind of state measures. That's the short answer.
Well, okay. So Ben, I got one last question, but it is long, so we'll try to get through it quickly. This one says, "Hi Ben, I've been a fan of your work since the Salon and Real News days. I work in digital marketing and have come to the conclusion that our collective addiction and dependency on social media presents a considerable challenge in terms of being in control of our communication. I know you are also critical about social media censorship. Do you see a way out of that predicament? It feels like even if all of their corrupt practices are exposed, social media companies will continue to have a pull on everyone on the left who is looking for exposure. Even worse, they can pay influencers to frame the debate in a way that doesn't really address these platforms' addictive design and pay-to-play model."
That is the question going forward for the kind of media left, if you will, people on the left who work with alternative media, and that includes people like us who do investigative work, but also citizen journalists who just live tweet and Periscope for fun or to help comrades in the free time. That's equally important work, and it's really concerning to see the total just concentration and monopolization that social media platforms have. It's something I talk about a lot. Unfortunately, I don't have the answer to it. I think it's an answer that we need to figure out kind of as a community. Because look, people will say, well, use Mastodon, use whatever other platform, Minds or whatever. And that's great. I mean, I've made platforms on those websites, but let's be real. The reason you want to use social media for most people, but especially for media, is because a lot of people use it. Now, you and your friends can go on Mastodon and have fun and hang out. That's fine, great. But as a journalist, I want to reach as many people as possible. That's why I use social media.
I personally, I would delete my Facebook account if not for the fact that I'm trying to reach people over the Primo Nutmeg Facebook page.
That's exactly right. Me too. Facebook is terrifying. Years ago, I stopped posting personal stuff. I mean, it's totalitarian, really, in the sense. And by the way, when we were talking about anarchism and criticism of so-called authoritarian governments, and look, I'm not saying that all these governments were in any way perfect. They certainly had a lot of problems. But the irony is that even the most so-called authoritarian government in the Eastern Bloc still had nothing on the authoritarianism that Western capitalist governments have now under surveillance capitalism, where the U.S., the NSA listens to basically every phone call, captures every single text and communication we have. I mean, that is just like... that is
probably anything that happens near a phone, near any microphone, probably.
Even if your phone is off, we now know that, or your computer is off, we know that the NSA and CIA have technology to use your device without you even knowing that it's on to record your conversations. I mean, we're talking about the most kind of totalitarian hellscape you can even imagine. And of course, combined with the most capitalist society in human history. It's not a coincidence those go together. Anyway, the point is that, getting back to this question, I think that what we have to do is what we're doing now, unfortunately, is kind of find a balance between using the existing social media platforms with all of their problems. YouTube, I mean, YouTube's so important. I think YouTube's more important. YouTube's certainly more important than Twitter. Twitter is still only used by like, what, 10% of the population. Facebook by more, but Facebook, I think there's still only 2 billion accounts in the world, which is not, that's a huge number of people, but it's, in terms of regular users, it's not still that many people. And then I think YouTube's the most important, actually. And that's why your channel is important, other channels. That's why we've been trying to grow on YouTube, because it was so dominated until recently by just these right-wing nut jobs and far-right freaks. And the YouTube algorithm was heavily supporting them for years from the very beginning. I remember getting InfoWars ads when I was in, like, I guess, yeah, in high school when YouTube first started becoming a thing. And I remember I was like, who is this weirdo Alex Jones, from the very beginning of YouTube as a platform? So, of course, a lot of liberals and people on the left have been calling for these people to be censored, but it really is a double-edged sword. And look, I'm not a free speech absolutist at all. I just made fun of that ridiculously stupid Harper's vanity letter that they posted by some of the most powerful people in the U.S. ruling class and media, commentariat, who want us to believe that their free speech is being infringed on. It's a joke. I'm not a free speech absolutist, but when it comes to corporations having control over free speech, we do have to realize that it is a very slippery slope, and I actually don't support social media platforms banning InfoWars and these other stupid platforms, as odious as they are, as much as I don't like them. It's not, look,
it almost gives them cover to some degree too, right? Because you hear from so many people that conservatives are being attacked, but you never hear about channels like this that are not a right-wing channel, that are the views are being throttled and people are being unsubscribed and whatnot.
That's absolutely right. And I'll make a quick analogy here. I remember that there was a debate. I mentioned Glenn Greenwald, whom I respect in many ways. I disagree with him on some issues, of course, but I think he's very solid and he's very principled and he's not an opportunist. And I remember one of the debates we had, and he wrote an article criticizing me at The Intercept, where he took the position, the kind of ACLU hardline absolutist free speech view, that these far-right figures like Milo Yiannopoulos that schools shouldn't kick them off of shouldn't cancel their events. I disagree with that. I actually think public universities are a good example of a case where I think it's a good idea to campaign to cancel the events of these far-right goons, these ghouls. They're horrific. Because this is a public institution funded by taxpayers and by tuition dollars. We ostensibly should have some democratic control over it. So, okay, I'm more comfortable giving it some leeway to to police speech. That is not in any way commensurate to a monopoly controlled by a small handful of capitalists. These corporate media platforms they're private tyranny, and they work with the state too. So it's the worst of both worlds. We're already getting the state-backed censorship with the private corporate censorship, the worst of both worlds, which is why I actually support. This is partially the answer to what the question was originally. I think these social media platforms should be public utilities, and as much as I criticize U.S. government censorship and propaganda on these platforms, it's already happening and it's inevitable because of the power of the U.S. over that's how capitalism works. That's why left libertarians understand why right-wing libertarians are extremely dumb, because the whole point is that corporate power can't exist without support from the state. That's how the only way capitalism can exist is with the state. Exactly, and defends their private property. But the point is that if you nationalized these and nationalized these social media platforms and turn them into public utilities, you're still going to get the problem of government censorship, which is already the problem we have. But because it's a public utility, you at least can exert some democratic grassroots influence on the institution. And at least the idea is to try to democratize it, unlike what it is now, where you have the worst of both worlds with the government censorship, and because it's a private company, they say, well, it's a private company, so we can do whatever we want. We can ban whoever we want. So I think that needs to be part of the campaign. That's my answer. Part of the campaign is moving to democratize these social media platforms, which, by the way, are international. So, I mean, public utility is making them a public utility is one solution, but I also think the ideal solution would be make them kind of international property. I mean, the only real institutions we have that could do that would maybe be something like the United Nations, which has its own issues. I'm not saying that it's some great, believe me, I have so many criticisms, but the United Nations it kind of has elements of internal democracy despite all their problems. It's an international institution. And Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and YouTube at this point are thoroughly international institutions. So if we're going to make them public utilities, they should be international public utilities. Or at least if they're a government utility, they can be like some kind of confederation of governments. So the idea is to democratize these social media platforms. And that's kind of how the internet works, although the internet is privatized in many ways, especially in the US. So I think we need to start thinking out of the box and have ideas like that, in addition to creating new platforms. But again, I'm sorry, Mastodon is not going to solve this problem because like 1 million people use Mastodon.
Well, Ben, I really do appreciate you being on the show today and going through all of these different issues. For folks out there who would like to follow you, kind of a good segue, what are the social media networks where they can do that?
Well, until I'm banned, I mean, I don't know if I'm shadow banned. I've heard I'm not, but until I'm shadow banned or totally suspended, you can find me on Twitter at Benjamin Norton. I don't usually go by Benjamin, but in Latin America, I'm Benjamin, so whatever. But you just look up Ben Norton, and definitely check out The Gray Zone, and you can find us on Twitter. You can go to thegrayzone.com. That's gray with the Yankee American spelling with an A. And then on YouTube, and I know this is a YouTube channel, so I want to thank my host here and Primo Nutmeg for having a lot of great, thoughtful interviews over the years. I've certainly learned a lot here. And we have our own channel. So subscribe to his channel, but then also go to The Gray Zone and subscribe to our channel.
Well, Ben, I really do appreciate you being on the show today, and I really do hope that you can be back at some point in the future.
Of course, my pleasure. And actually, I'm sure you get asked this a lot, and I watch your interviews sometimes, but I've never heard this. I've always been curious what Primo Nutmeg meant.
So I am from Connecticut, which is known as the Nutmeg State. And I was trying to, before recording the first episode, my two friends, Jack and Patrick, were actually my first guests on the show. And I was trying to think of something that would be like psychedelic nutmeg. I don't know if you knew you can trip on nutmeg. I don't know if anybody ever told you that.
What?
Supposedly,
No,
I actually did it once when I was a teenager, and I just like slept for 2 days, so it was not a good experience.
It wasn't a good trip.
No. But anyway, so I was trying to think of something that would be a play off of Connecticut being the nutmeg state, and also, it's like psychedelic or whatever. And then my friend Patrick suggested Primo, so Primo Nutmeg. And I've stuck with it. I've considered changing it a few times, though. I was thinking maybe like Primo Truth or something like that might be good. But just so many people have told me that, I guess for branding reasons, you should just keep it. Oliver Stone, thank you very much for sitting down with me for this interview. I really do appreciate it.
Well, anybody called Primo Nutmeg deserves my attention.
For branding reasons, it's really good, because if you look at Primo Nutmeg, believe me, no one in the world aside from you has ever used that phrase.
Well, Ben, again, I really do appreciate you being on the show today, and I hope that at some point in the future we can have you back.
Sure. Well, I'm surprised you said that after I ranted so long, but thanks for having me. Thanks for letting me rant and talk about these issues. And yeah, let's keep up the debate. Look, I think that there should be more healthy debate on the left of these issues. And Twitter, people say that they also think I'm really mean or angry on Twitter. I am angry, but I'm not mean. and that's because of the nature of the platform. It's 240 characters or whatever, 220 or whatever it is. I don't even remember. So yeah, we should have kind of more discussions like this in longer form and kind of parse out some of these ideas.